The Murdoch media empire is in all-out damage control mode this morning as the scandal as British papers continues to spread. On this side of the Atlantic, the FBI has opened a preliminary investigation of whether phone hacking or other illegal conduct took place in the U.S. And the dizzying pace of developments has made headlines around the world.
MPs finally forced Murdoch to withdraw his B-Sky B bid. His empire's cracked, but is it broken?
We're following also breaking news in London as well this morning, where the embattled chief executive of Rupert Murdoch's British newspapers has resigned.
News International will issue a statement shortly to say that Rebekah Brooks has indeed resigned as the chief executive of News International.
More damaging details are emerging in Rupert Murdoch's phone hacking scandal. For the first time, other News Corp properties are being implicated in the growing scandal.
The Queen of Wapping, Rebekah Brooks, resigns, leaving the fight for News International's future to James and Rupert Murdoch.
Well, Rebekah Brooks has done more than just resign. This breaking news on Sunday morning. She was forced out on Friday, of course, as the head of Murdoch's British newspapers, arrested today by police in London in connection with the scandal. Her predecessor, Les Hitton, who ran the Wall Street Journal's parent company, Dow Jones, resigned also on Friday. Meanwhile, Murdoch was forced to drop his $12 billion bid to buy British Sky Broadcasting. And yesterday, the company took out full-page ads in rival British papers with a simple headline: "We are sorry." But in an interview with the Journal, Murdoch says the company has made only minor mistakes in handling this debacle. Really? Joining us now to talk about the worldwide fallout in New York, Michael Wolff, the editor of Adweek and author of a biography of Rupert Murdoch. David Folkenflik, media correspondent for National Public Radio, who's just back from London. And here in Washington, Sarah Smith, the Washington correspondent for the UK's Channel 4 News. And Sarah Smith, this extraordinary development on a Sunday of Rebekah Brooks being arrested by the police, how much does this further the damage to Murdoch's media company?
Well, it's interesting. On the face of it, it looks very, very bad. And it means that we're probably one step closer to James Murdoch being questioned or arrested over this, which really would damage both the company and the family very, very much. But there's probably something quite clever going on here. She was arrested by appointment, if you've ever heard of such a thing, which is remarkable given that there's accusations the police are too close to News International anyway. And she's due to give evidence, of course, along with Rupert and James Murdoch, to a parliamentary committee on Tuesday. Now she's been arrested, she may very well say she can't answer these questions because it would interfere with the police inquiry.
I will not be surprised if she says that. And David Folkenflik, having just been in Britain, is there a sense that this is not just a news of the world problem anymore, but a fundamental problem with the way that Murdoch's company does business?
Oh, I think it's absolutely the case. I mean, you've seen this reached into the executive suites, not just the News of the World. We now have had the last two previous editors of the News of the World, Rebekah Brooks, her predecessor, Andrew Coulson, who had been a close aide and advisor to Prime Minister David Cameron, have both been arrested in this matter. And I think it's worth pointing out that this is a scandal that encompasses both the question of hacking into voicemail messages of the targets of stories, royals, celebrities, politicians, and now we know victims of terror attacks as well are also alleged, but also that this is a police corruption scandal in which police appear to have been routinely paid for information that had been supposed to be secret and confidential, databases accessed, other matters like that. And senior officials, the question are whether their relationships were too cozy, both on a personal and in terms of payments, questions whether they soft-pedaled investigations 4 years ago. So this really seeps into the law enforcement institutions, and also it calls into question the proximity of those relationships between top executives, people like Rebekah Brooks, also James Murdoch, the son of Rupert Murdoch, a very senior News Corp executive.
Let me bring in Michael Wolff. It seemed that Rupert Murdoch was trying to protect Rebekah Brooks. He was resisting her resignation for more than a week. Now is he down to protecting his son James and himself, now that these other people have either quit or have been taken into custody?
Of course he is. And I think that there's another interesting point to make here about the way that this, about the entire company, because there are really two companies. There is the perfectly reasonable, ordinary entertainment company, which provides most of the revenue, most of the News Corporation revenue. And then there is this newspaper company, which is sort of a vestigial company. It exists because Rupert Murdoch himself wants it to exist. And that's really where the issue is, where the contagion is. It's within the newspaper. It affects two things. It affects the newspaper company, and it affects people named Murdoch who run the newspaper company.
Right.
So I think more and more we're going to begin to see that split. I mean, in fact, you know, there really is a simple solution for the company as a whole, which is to get rid of the newspapers and get rid of the Murdochs.
Rupert doesn't want to do that because he loves newspapers. Sarah Smith, Democratic Senator Dick Durbin on Meet the Press this morning. He wants congressional hearings into the Murdoch empire, and there's a preliminary FBI investigation, although no evidence at this point of any wrongdoing by any of the U.S. Properties of News Corp. But is this now turning into a two-front war for the company on both sides of the Atlantic?
You can see they're absolutely terrified of having to fight this war in the U.S. as well. The evidence is very thin to non-existent at the moment that there was any phone hacking done in America. Certainly, nobody has uncovered any evidence that 9/11 victims were hacked. Jude Law has just brought a lawsuit against one of the Murdoch papers in Britain, The Sun, alleging that whilst he was at JFK Airport, he knew his voicemails were being listened to. He could tell from the story that appeared in the paper the next day. That would be criminal activity in the US if it had happened. But what the Murdochs really have to do is make sure it doesn't go near any of their titles here, the Wall Street Journal or the New York Post or any of their properties here.
David Folkenflik, I wonder if you think the U.S. part of this story is somewhat hype. We have a lot of people, members of Congress and certain liberal media types jumping on and saying we must investigate. But, you know, the locus of the story is still very much in Britain.
Well, look, there's no shortage of people in the American media establishment and the American liberal political establishment who have taken issue with the way in which Murdoch's properties, Fox News, the New York Post, have done business. That said, you know, we got to be careful. You know, usually you don't want to get ahead of yourselves. In this one, the story has each time surpassed your wildest expectations in the past 2 weeks.
It happened again this morning.
Absolutely right. I would say in terms of the American implications, there's the question of whether British journalists for News Corp broke the law here in the 9/11. As you say, the evidence is scant. But there are also laws on the books that if the Attorney General were to instigate a wider-ranging investigation, or the SEC, even actions that were illegal taken by News Corp employees abroad in, for example, Great Britain, could reflect on the ability of News Corp to hold on to American broadcasting licenses here. So you could see some repercussions under the question of if they interpreted it as foreign officials being bribed, as has been widespreadly alleged and with some substance, it appears.
Once you start an investigation, you don't know what kind of rocks are going to be turned over. Michael Wolff, let's talk about Murdoch's role himself. He, has the full-page ads showing the apology. He went to visit the family of the murdered girl whose phone was hacked into, one of the most horrifying abuses of this whole thing. But then he talks to the Wall Street Journal, and here he is defending James. I think he acted as fast as he could, the moment he could. It doesn't seem like he's doing the full contrition route yet.
One of the curious things about Rupert Murdoch is that when he gives an interview, he only gives it to news outlets he owns. And those are always very funny interviews because he is essentially telling his reporters what questions to ask and how to cast his response.
Wait, how do you know he's telling his reporters what questions to ask? That's not entirely fair. The Wall Street Journal is a pretty good newspaper.
Because I've sat with him when he's done this. I know who calls before. It is absolutely the Murdoch playbook. You call ahead, you set it up, you tell them what questions to ask. In the middle of the interview, he often does this.
So what does all this get him? If he does an interview with an outlet that he controls?
Oh, I don't know what it gets him. It gets him further into a deeper hole. I mean, in that interview, he sounds. I mean, it sounds. First thing, his answers are peculiar. His view of the world is peculiar. It is the Murdoch. What we see is the Murdoch who believes that he is in control. And so he believes he's in control, and yet to the rest of the world, what is obviously happening is that we see him losing control in a way we see him out of control.
And Sarah, he also said in that journal interview that News Corp has handled this crisis extremely well in every way possible. There are just some minor mistakes.
Which is ludicrous, because you just watch the way they've had to reverse themselves all through the course of the week. First of all, they weren't going to appear in front of a committee of MPs. Then hours later they were. He wasn't going to accept Rebecca Brooks' resignation. Now he's had to. And as you mentioned earlier, take these adverts in British newspapers saying they were sorry. Can you imagine what circumstances in the last 50 years Rupert Murdoch must have ever said sorry to anybody. And he's been going around London saying it to as many people as he can find this week, which must be one of the most humiliating experiences of his life.
Clearly, he's getting some high-level PR advice. David Folkenflik, we have a short time before break. A National Review online says that you are treating this as the second coming of Watergate and suggests, I guess Geraldo Rivera once said that you were a weak-kneed, backstabbing, sweaty palm reporter. So I'm giving you a chance to defend your honor.
Well, my palms are relatively dry. Other than that, people can decide for themselves. I think it's an incredible story with political, law enforcement, journalistic implications, and I think it really is going to determine the fate of this major media company based here in the United States. So I plead guilty to thinking it's a real story.
I think we can all agree it's a real story, and a story that seems to get more incredible every day. Back talking about the Murdoch media scandal and Michael Wolff. I talked to a couple of former reporters for the New York Post, gossipy Page 6, which had its own brushwood scandal a few years ago. They talked about a culture of thuggishness where reporters would play favorites and where they would go after people that Murdoch or the company didn't like, and they had stories killed when they went after somebody that the company did like. Could this whole mess, this whole debacle, morph into a debate over Murdoch's media ethics or his company's media ethics here in the U.S.?
Well, of course it could. As a matter of fact, I think it already has. What we're really dealing with is a portrait of this, an ethical portrait of this company, and I think the crucial thing is, and the thing that has happened to the company is that they've gotten behind the temperament of the times has changed, and they haven't realized this. So I think we're going to look at, the New York Post is a good example. They probably haven't hacked phones themselves. Actually, their staff is too small. Hacking requires too many resources. But nevertheless, the New York Post is part of the Murdoch method of reward and punishment. Mm-hmm. That's how he has built his power base. He likes you, he rewards you. He doesn't like you, he uses his newspapers to punish you.
Right. We do have to be careful, I think, about some of these allegations. For example, a British blogger reported that CNN's Piers Morgan, who used to be the editor of The Mirror, may have known about illegal conduct that took place at that newspaper some years ago. Piers Morgan has absolutely denied knowing about any such conduct, and I haven't seen any evidence. If that changes, I'll let you know. David Folkenflik, but people, when I'm interviewed, people ask me.
That sounded like an official company denial.
That's the official denial is all we have because Piers Morgan hasn't talked about it extensively. I'd be happy to talk to him about it. David Folkenflik, when I'm interviewed, people ask me, what about Fox News? What about the New York Post? And I wonder if you think those questions are unfair at this point since the scandal is essentially in London.
Well, the scandal is in London. I think one of the things to remember about Mr. Murdoch is that a lot of his DNA, sort of an Australian, Anglo-American institution, has come through the London newspapers that he oversaw to great success there. And particularly, you've got, if you look at the fellow who is the editor-in-chief of the News of the World, just before it was shuttered last week, it was the guy who was the #2 editor here at
the New York Post, yeah.
at the New York Post. There's closely linked and enmeshed DNA, which is not to say in any way that the allegations there are the same ones here.
Some of the people move
fairness,
back and forth. I gotta cut you off because we have to go to break, and I want to get Sarah Smith in. This story is going to continue to get bigger before the crisis passes, in your view?
Oh, absolutely. In Britain, certainly, and people will carry on looking for tentacles of it here, as Britain's going to have to start examining everything about its relationship with the press, not just the kind of stories they cover, but were the politicians too close with the press, were the police too close to the press. This is going to take a very long time to unravel.
Very incestuous culture, and the answer preliminarily seems to be yes. Sarah Smith, Michael Wolff, David Folkenflik, thanks very much for joining us.